I'm Miruna Achim. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Paris. I'm here with my co-fellow, Patricia Mindus, and we will be talking today in this Carte Blanche about the project I have been working on, which is called The Breath of Greenstones, Towards a Sensory History of Mesoamerican Jade. So thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you. A breath of greenstones. Can you tell me a little bit about this project?
Okay, so it's a project where I'm researching the circulation of Mesoamerican jade artifacts as objects of science, of archaeology, of aesthetics, of politics, in the course of 5 centuries. So this is between the late, 1521, basically, when Cortes invades Mexico, which will become New Spain, and today. The last bit of this project happens today in the sequels of extraction, mining, illegal trafficking of jadeite stones in the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit more about these artifacts? You speak about jaded stones. So what are these artifacts?
Okay, so first of all, jade is a generic term. It's a generic term that includes a range of minerals, most of which are green, but not all of them. Some of them are purple, some of them are white, some of them are sort of beige cream colored, some are very dark, almost black. Of these, the best known are jadeite and nephrite. So nephrite is, as a mineral, is much more common, and jadeite is not. And there are also minerals that are associated with Asian cultures, not only with Mesoamerica. By the way, Mesoamerica is the area that includes today Mexico and most of Central America. So nephrite and jadeite we also have in China, for instance. But in Mesoamerica, we only have jadeite and other greenstones, hard greenstones that are along the same ranges. And these artifacts that I'm talking about, they belong to pretty much all the ancient Mesoamerican cultures. They include the Olmecs, which is the most ancient one, the Mayas, the so-called Aztecs or Mexicas, Zapotecs, cultures from Costa Rica, and mostly they refer to royalty, they refer to divinity. At first they were used as tools, but then gradually they were used mostly for ritual purposes. So jadeite in the form of earplugs or colors with beads, little animals. They could refer to corn, to fertility. Kings were buried with jadeite masks on their faces. The idea there being that just as corn sprouts out of the ground, the king will rise up into afterlife. Of course, all these uses were lost on Hernán Cortés when he first arrived off the Gulf of Mexico, and he sustained a series of exchanges with people sent by Moctezuma or Moctezuma, both terms are used. So he sustained exchanges with them, and he received gold, and he received greenstones, which we don't know for sure if they're jadeite or other greenstones, so that's why I'm not using the chemical term all the time. So he received all this, and he received gold objects as well. And the gold objects for him had immense value. So he sends letters back to his king saying, well, look, I received this, it's worth this much, but the greenstones had no value for him. So he just sends them along as part of the royal fifth, which is what the king's subjects sent back to the king when they acquired or looted stuff in conquered territory. So this is how the story begins, and from there I'm very much interested, not so much in the ancient part, but what happens to the circulations of jade afterwards in the transatlantic world post-conquest.
Okay, but so why tell this story? Because one could think that it would be interesting to focus on the uses of jade in the Mesoamerican context. So why tell this story this way?
Okay, well, there are various reasons. First of all, in Mesoamericanist archaeology has done a fantastic job telling that kind of story. Mesoamerican archaeology includes today archaeologists, mineralogists, many different specialists who have been working on the vestiges and ruins of what's left on the material culture of Mesoamerica. But the story that has not been told precisely is the story of what happens to these artifacts as they circulate afterwards. And most of them actually circulate not through Mesoamerica, but they will circulate around Europe, then the US in the 20th century, but not so much in New Spain or in colonial Mexico, right? So the other reason I'm interested in this story is because there's a tendency, there's an obsession with origins where the Mesoamerican past has been recounted as if it stopped in as if these objects had no more use after 1521. And what I am interested in recovering is not only the uses of the stone, but also what it means for people to have used them in different ways. Okay, so what I'm really interested is in understanding like I said, the circulations of these objects post-conquest, basically because I believe that past exists for the present and in the present many times. The past exists as a collection of objects in the present, and I always wonder about what kind of objects we select from the past to tell different stories. What kind of associations of objects are reinforced, and on the other side of the same coin, what kind of associations are erased? What do we forget about objects as we select certain aspects of them? For instance, in the case of Mesoamerican jade artifacts, at the very beginning, at the beginning of the first contacts with the Europeans, these objects were considered beautiful, beautifully wrought, beautifully carved, and in that sense, that was important because they were seen as an indication that these people could be evangelized, that they were human enough to become evangelized by missionaries. There's a haunting story of a missionary who arrives and looks around for green idols to destroy them. He's pursuing idolatries, and he cries. He describes this object, a jadeite object, and he cries when he sees it because he cannot believe that God could have created such a beautiful object, could have given people the skills to create such a beautiful object in order to worship God's worst enemies, right? And then you get back to the 18th century, for instance, and Buffon, who's a naturalist, a natural philosopher, when he writes his history of minerals, he talks about jade as being an incredibly soft mineral. He talks about it as being a soft mineral that is shaped while it's still kind of sort of a mud or a clay, and then you stick it in the fire and it becomes hard again. And that tells us, I mean, what Buffon was telling us with that is that Amerindians, pre-Hispanic peoples, were not equipped, were not skilled enough to have created such beautiful objects. So, of course, it had to be soft. So in the course of 200 years, jade goes from being hard and translucent and beautiful to being a soft mineral. So in these sort of transformations of the material, right, we also see a transformation or changes in the way these civilizations in the Americas were being perceived. These ancient civilizations were perceived within a larger context, history of mankind, of humankind.
So, if I understand you right, jade was sometimes hard and sometimes soft. But how can it be the case that the same substance can be attributed different properties in this way? And how can we track it through time?
Yeah, well, in my previous work that I have done, which has been mostly on history of collections and more broadly on American antiquities, for instance, in the 18th and 19th century, those antiquities were considered, for the most part, grotesque, ugly, bizarre, incomprehensible. And they will become classical and beautiful by the end of the 19th century, by the 20th century. And they become coveted as objects of collecting, and people pay great prices for them at auctions now. Jade antiquities bring really high prices in particular. Well, in this project, I'm taking that a little bit further to say that even materiality is historical, not just what we consider subjective approaches to these objects, such as beauty, but the material itself is something that changes with time. And there, that gives me the sort of the subtitle of my project, which is sensory history of Mesoamerican artifacts. And what I'm really interested in is how at different moments this stone is being interacted with. Different qualities of the stone are being highlighted over others, they're privileged over others as a way of interacting with it. So color was a very important one in the 16th century when jadeite artifacts first arrive, or jade artifacts more broadly, not necessarily jadeite, arrive in Europe, and they're adopted, inscribed into natural histories, which were many times organized by color. So greenness will matter in the 16th century. Then we have, as I said, things like hardness, chemical properties can matter at different times. But what really interests me is by looking at how people work the stone, what matters. It doesn't, okay, I'm not trying to say that when they concentrate on color, they wouldn't concentrate on hardness, but it's the most important one. At different moments, it's a different quality of the stone. And that way of interacting with the stone many times tells us how people are organized also socially, how work is organized and distributed, who does what, but also tells us, as I was implying before, tells us more about the, how America is perceived. These ancient civilizations from the Americas are perceived in these histories. So what I follow are interactions, and what I follow are gestures and practices of making, of producing.
So it's an object that can shift substance, shape, and meaning. And how do you go about to do this from a methodological point of view?
Well, this is what I have struggled with in the course of this whole year, and I have thankfully had the time and the colleagues to be able to test different ways of working with it, and also to test challenges from colleagues and people who have had the patience to hear. And it's a longue durée project, as you can tell. It's 4 centuries that I approached, 4 or 5 centuries, 5 centuries. But at the same time, I really focus on the detail. I focus on details, I focus on descriptions, on very intimate descriptions and relations with the stone. Because one thing that really interests me is, as I said, making. What does really interacting, carving, carrying out a chemical analysis, for instance, destroying, what does that tell us about the object itself? So making is a form of producing knowledge as well. And for that, I really draw on a very broad array of sources. It's a project that goes from ethnographic fieldwork that I've been doing in Guatemala in the past few years, but also manuals for the extirpation of idolatries, also natural histories from various centuries, I don't know, chemical analyses, a lot of archival work as well. So this is what I do methodologically. The point is that I would like to stress, though, is for me, it's not a teleological history. I'm not trying to say that we get better at understanding what these objects are. I'm not saying that with time they become truer or we become more precise. In fact, what I'm much more interested in is what are the stakes in the way they're described at different moments. What is it in the beauty of an object in the 16th century that would bring somebody to tears and bring that person to destroy it? Like, this is what I'm after. Not trying to say that we're so much closer to the truth today than they were in the 18th century.
But how about the title, The Breath of Greenstones?
Yeah. That came first. That came very early because it's something that really surprised me as I was reading some of the earliest descriptions of these objects in 16th century natural histories. And there is in particular it's a canonical, very well-known compilation called the Florentine Codex that is in Florence now, but it was produced in a Franciscan convent in Tlatelolco. Was a co-production between descendants of the conquest and Franciscan monks that were in the convent there, particularly Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. And the book is a book that compiles together, it's a sort of an encyclopedia of pre-Hispanic life in central Mexico. So we have natural history, civil history, political history, how people lived, their morals, how they got along, their métier, their trades and arts, and there's a section of natural history of stones, and in that there's a description, and they also have beautiful illustrations. There's a description of a man prospecting for greenstones, which is the most valuable, as I was trying to say earlier, the most valuable of stones for Mesoamericans. And he does it by placing himself against the sunrise. And as the sun rises up, there's vapor coming out of the ground. So he says, or the text says, that this is the breath of the precious stone manifesting itself. It's the stone breathes and sends out vapor. And sometimes it turns the grass greener as well. So again, those are some of the qualities of the precious stone to bring freshness there. And there we see something that I'm very interested in this, in the course of this project, to break down these binaries that we're so used to. We divide the world into animate and inanimate, life and lifeless, subject and object, things that have agency and things that do not. And in fact, things had a lot of agency in pre-Hispanic times, but they also did in early modern Europe. Mesoamericans were not so radically other. In early modern natural histories, stones jump around and they do things. They reveal people who have been unfaithful. They have all sorts of properties like that. So this breakdown into the life and the lifeless would make no sense to an early modern European or to somebody living in Mesoamerica. And then I was very surprised because I'm reading 21st century reports by geologists who are prospecting for jadeite in the Motagua River Valley, where the sources of jadeite are. And they look for green and fresh herbs and cattle grazing, because it turns out that jadeite does have, when it decomposes, it's quite fertile, the soil. There's these, it pushed me to play a little bit with the idea of life and lifelessness, and how even today the relations people might have with a stone doesn't necessarily imply the sort of inertness that we're so used to thinking about the mineral world.
But so far you've told us about different moments and the history of jade. Can you tell us a little bit more about jade in the present?
Yeah. So for a very long time, it was only artifacts, jade artifacts, that circulated in the transatlantic world. And also, there's a lot of jade coming from New Zealand, for instance, and from China. So a lot of what I'm saying here is, in fact, has to do with how people were thinking, were putting Mesoamerica in relation to those other places. But I haven't gone into it here. But while artifacts circulated, there is no knowledge about where the sources, where Mesoamerican people had extracted jadeite. And partially that is because jade use was prohibited. So the practices were suspended in the 16th century, since it's so associated with religious and ritual purposes. So people were not extracting jadeite. I'm not trying to say that nobody was using it. Maybe there were communities that were still using them. But in general, we can talk about mostly knowledge about jadeite sources and practices of lapidary practices disappearing for the most part. And it's not until the 20th century that archaeologists start wondering about where are these sources. And it's not until 1954 that a geologist at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., William Fauchard, finds and confirms that there's raw jadeite in the Motagua River Valley. And since then, there have been a lot of projects for prospecting for jadeite, which get, in fact, entangled, or not so much entangled, they're shaped nowadays by global warming. Because at the end of the 20th century, 1998, I believe, Hurricane Mitch, which destroyed large parts of Central America, killed 20,000 people, it eroded the topsoils, and it made possible, it sort of made possible for outcrops of jadeite to emerge to the surface. So since then, since the early 2000s, jadeite has become very much a very coveted commodity, and there's serious extraction going on. There's legal concessions, mining concessions, because most of the subsoil is the property of the Guatemalan government. So there are legal concessions, and people extract jadeite, and some of it is used to carve replicas, and they're sold to museums and tourists. It's at the sort of at the heart of a tourist industry in Antigua, Guatemala. But most of the stuff is trafficked illegally, and there's a lot of organized crime involved in it, because a gram of very valuable jadeite is worth more than gold or more than cocaine today. So it leaves behind a story of destruction and devastation, invasion of communal lands, of campesinos who live in, peasants who live in those areas. And part of my questioning throughout this book has to do, as I said at the beginning, with what associations of jadeite do we not see when we choose to always associate it with a remote past or with a pristine mineral? Many times these much more opaque and violent associations, as in the case of other minerals, we choose to forget, we choose to suppress. So the violence spending on extraction is often forgotten in the case of jadeite. So this is part of the story as well that I want to tell.
But let me ask you also finally, how did this fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Paris contribute to your project?
In many ways. For one thing, because it gave me the incentive and the luxury of time and thinking and conversation with just amazing colleagues. So, I mean, that in itself, for an academic who teaches and who's on academic commissions and all sorts of stuff like that, has been incredibly valuable. At the same time, it was very stimulating because I had to present a project on this early in the year. and I got a lot of comments. So I just took those comments and kept working and rethinking them, and a lot of pushback as well, and that's just as valuable as getting very positive comments, getting comments that say, I'm not sure how this is working. So at the beginning, when I first arrived here, I thought I would have a draft of a book. This is how I had arrived. And now I don't have a draft of a book, but I think what I have is a much more complex understanding of the story that I want to tell, and a story that has been co-produced, like a lot of the knowledge that I'm talking about in this project, that has been co-produced with colleagues here at the Institute and colleagues in the broader area in Paris, at the École des Hautes Études, that I'd like to acknowledge colleagues there as well, in Lyon, at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, and various other places where I have had a chance for people to be patient and curious, to ask me and to push me forward with the project. And you have been one of them, so thank you.
Thank you. So we're very much looking forward to reading this book as it comes out with this fascinating story on the breadth of greenstones.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you.